To see you. Am I speaking at a good volume and everything? Sorry, this is so weird. Okay. So I've been teaching online since March, and just seeing you all having fun together in the same room is like, oh, I miss being on campus with students so much. Thanks for having me. I'm going to pull up my notes now, and I won't be able to see you, but I'll try to check back. It's really great to be here, and I'm glad that you're taking time out of your busy week to think about and things of the spirit and be with God and with each other. And I'm going to talk about what virtue is and continue on to describe what it looks like in the lives of two very different Americans. So in the Christian tradition, virtue is a way to describe what human excellence looks like in light of our belief that we're created by God and in a relationship with God. We like to say that virtues are truth claims about the human person. The person who has virtue is happier, more flourishing, and more fully alive than the one without it. By describing what the virtues are like and how we live them out, Christian ethics offers a vision of the human good. What does it look like to be the kind of person who's worthy of heaven? And also sketches out a path to achieving it, be that kind of person. Virtues help us integrate our internal feelings and attitudes with our outer actions. So having a virtue makes it easier to discern and do the virtuous thing, and vice versa. Virtuous actions help us form those virtuous habits. So some examples of virtues that the Christian tradition values really highly are, some examples are humility, which Jesus demonstrates in becoming human, fortitude, which combines the qualities of courage and perseverance, and justice, which can be a quality a person has when they're committed to acting fairly towards others. We could add other virtues, including loyalty, honesty, generosity, faith, hope, love, and the two virtues I'll discuss tonight, temperance and prudence. So when we think about leading a moral life, sometimes we might be tempted to focus on certain actions that we should do, like helping the poor, or that we should avoid, like lying or adultery. And virtue ethics does look at actions, but it also looks at the personal qualities that underlie our actions. So we would ask, what kind of person am I? Am I loyal or false, brave or cowardly? And thinking consistently right across the whole pattern of your life, not just have you ever done one loyal thing, but generally in different situations, could you be expected to act loyally? Then we could move on to asking, what kind of person should I be? I should be more brave, more loyal, more faithful. And how should I act in order to become that kind of person? Well, I need to practice bravery and ask God to help me grow in faith. So I'm going to seek out opportunities to be brave, but I still can't do it alone. Virtue is always also a gift from God. A great way to pursue virtue is to learn from the stories of those who live virtues well in their lives, what we call exemplars. You can hardly discuss humility without thinking of St. Francis, loyalty without thinking of St. Joseph, love without St. Mary Magdalene. Learning from the stories of real other humans is kind of an inconvenient truth, for the simple fact that, unlike Jesus, they are not God. Other people are just as flawed and as sinful as you and me. And when we encounter the lives they lived and the virtues they showed throughout their lives, it becomes a lot harder to convince ourselves that we shouldn't try for the same. So tonight I picked two virtue exemplars who are very different. A Black man from the 20th century, a white woman from the 19th. A married man, a nun, a Catholic, a Muslim. God is calling you to virtue wherever you are and whoever you are. Our virtues don't all look the same. Something that's relatively easy for one person might demand heroic courage for another. We start in different places, but we're all being called to grow. And learning from exemplars is a great way to do that. In these hard times for our country, I'm going to talk about the virtues of two great Americans, Malcolm X, an exemplar of prudence, and St. Katharine Drexel, exemplar of temperance. So first, what is the virtue of prudence? What does it look like? Prudence means practical wisdom. It involves understanding reality around us and shaping our actions in response to that reality. If you can picture someone who's always charging around trying to fix things, but making things worse because they don't stop first to get all the information and integrate that information with what they already know, that person might have a deep desire for justice or a deep faith, but they're not being prudent. So this is why Christian thinkers always say that we need prudence to pursue the good. People talk about it as the chief of the virtues, for example. In a sense, we need to know what goal we're aiming for before we can take steps to get there. And prudence is the virtue that helps us set good goals by learning the truth of things and integrating that into our understanding. My favorite exemplar of prudence is Malcolm X. a Black civil rights activist and lay religious leader in the 20th century US. He was a contemporary of Dr. Martin Luther King, and if you learned about him in your US history class, you probably learned that Dr. King wanted nonviolence and Malcolm wanted Black liberation by any means necessary. So before I had learned much more than that about him, I kind of assumed that since Dr. King was obviously good and they're often placed in contrast, Malcolm X must have been wrong or even dangerous. But when I got to college, I learned more about him and I couldn't believe how wrong my first impressions had been. Malcolm X was born in Omaha in 1925. His childhood was profoundly shaped by white racist violence. His family had to move frequently because of threats from the Klan, and his father died in a suspicious accident, which his family believed to be a hate crime, while Malcolm was still a child. As a young man, he served time in jail for a series of robberies, where he converted to a fringe religious movement called the Nation of Islam, or NOI. The NOI was a sectarian movement that blended aspects of Orthodox Islamic views with calls for Black separatism, hatred of white people, and violent resistance to racist oppression. After serving his time, Malcolm X threw himself into organizing for the NOI, traveling widely to promote its views. He was much admired for his steady leadership style and skill as a communicator, and rose to a top position within the nation. His social connections, income, and eventually the housing for his wife and family all came from his high status within the organization of the Nation of Islam. But he started to be troubled by the group's extremist views and especially by the immoral behavior of their leader, Elijah Muhammad. Thinking for himself, he began his shift away from advocating violence with his famous 1964 speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. And he developed a theological justification for his evolving views when he was able to make a pilgrimage to Mecca and travel through several Muslim-majority nations. There he saw Muslims of all races and backgrounds praying to God in the Orthodox Islamic tradition he had come to revere. He experienced a proud, diverse, and global Islam, a religion of peace, which couldn't be more different from the separatist violence preached by the NOI. When Malcolm returned to the US, he publicly broke with the Nation of Islam, attempting to correct the record on the discrepancy between mainstream Islam and the Nation of Islam's teaching. He denounced separatism and racial hatred and tried to ally himself with the nonviolent civil rights movement. His collaboration on his autobiography, that book I picked up in college, which really changed my worldview, represented a public analysis and recantation of many of his earlier views. So I know that most of us don't like the experience of being wrong in public. I often have to reassure students that it's okay to think out loud in class, because even if you make a mistake, that's how your thoughts and your understanding grow. But imagine finding out you were that wrong about something that important to you, as Malcolm did when he discovered that true Islam is a peaceful religion for people of every race. The whole time he thought he was sharing what he knew about God and the path to God through the Islamic faith. And imagine the struggles he must have faced when he realized he'd gotten it wrong. The temptation must have been immense to just brush it over, and maybe to try and convince himself that the NOI's views weren't that bad, to try and forget what he had learned and go on with his separatist path. That would have been a pathway to great success for him. He was being groomed as Elijah Muhammad's successor. But his prudence, his love for the truth, and his love for God wouldn't let him do that. He immediately got to work correcting the record and making amends, even though it meant leaving his job, his friends, and the community he'd had his whole adult life. It's hard to think of any public figure in the 20th century US who made a more radical public recommitment of life, someone who was able to change so profoundly in response to learning their previous views were wrong. Malcolm's transformation was not occasioned by a public exposure of wrongdoing, like someone who apologizes only after getting caught. It was just his exposure to the truth. Islam is a religion of peace that invites people of all races into a relationship with God. It was this exposure to the truth and his prudent ability to discern the truth and respond to it that occasioned this dramatic shift. His right judgment, intellectual humility, and ready response to the truth he discerned hold him up as an exemplar of prudence for our modern times. Malcolm's conversion and public recantation were not uninformed or naive. He was aware of the real possibility of the consequences that did tragically follow: his assassination by vengeful Nation of Islam members in 1965. His commitment to the truth and to trying to fix the spread of untruth he had done so effectively as a skilled leader and communicator ultimately made him a martyr to the truth he had found and to his own undeniable prudence. So what can we in these hard days of 2021 learn from Malcolm X as an exemplar of prudence? I think he is a great person to guide us as we deal with an epidemic of misinformation. In this country, we've got people who would rather resort to violence than believe their political candidate lost. We've got people who are intentionally spreading lies about the inner workings of our government, those who spread medical misinformation and even actively try to stop others from getting the life-saving COVID vaccine. And we might say, oh, I'm not involved in any of that, and I really hope you're not. But we've all succumbed to the temptation to spread information without checking it out, whether it be on social media or gossip about another person. I find myself most tempted to do this when it's information that already confirms my own biases that someone or something is irredeemably bad. Sharing information about someone I think is bad makes me feel good sometimes because it confirms my belief that I'm not like them. And Malcolm X experienced that too. He knew from his own experience that white people's violence had harmed his family profoundly. That was a fact. So when the Nation of Islam came along saying white people are literal devils, it had to make a certain sort of sense. And he believed it. And we all do this kind of thing. But not all of us are willing, like Malcolm X was, to entertain new information that challenges our existing worldview, to say I was wrong, and to devote ourselves to spreading the truth. In 2021, Malcolm X invites us to be brave in finding, understanding, and sharing the truth. When you know there's untruth out there, whether it's something really obvious like QAnon, or a rumor about someone, or action that seems to be coming from a place of bias, calling it out can feel really scary. We're worried about harming our relationship with that person, and we don't know what to say. And it might feel easier to just write them off. And one good thing I've learned this year is that having those hard conversations and calling out untruth is a skill you can learn and build. And one thing I learned from Malcolm is that telling the truth is a way of loving people. Malcolm risked his life and lost his life so he could share the truth he knew about God. I don't want any of you to risk your life. If your safety and stability depends on a person who's lost in untruth, get yourself to safety and stability first, and then, you can go from there. But short of that, let's all learn from Malcolm X that we can find out the truth, we can allow it to change our ways of thinking, and we can be brave enough to say, I was wrong. That's what prudence means. I want to talk about another virtue, the virtue of temperance. Temperance is the virtue that helps us moderate our desires so we can focus on and pursue good goals. As humans, we have natural desires for food, drink, sleep, sex. As human beings in society, we might desire status, attention, and power. And none of these are bad things per se. They all can be good when used in the right way, in ways that fit with our human nature. A person who's really temperate can enjoy those good things in a reasonable way, without spending every waking minute restraining her desires, but just going through life experiencing desire in a rational way. So our job is to integrate those desires into our life, so we're not being controlled by them and we can focus on listening to God's plan for us. One of my favorite exemplars of temperance is Saint Katharine Drexel, who lived from 1858 to 1955. She's one of the first Americans to be canonized. She was born into a wealthy, privileged Catholic family in Philadelphia. Her parents died young, and she found herself a young single woman with a fortune worth, at the time, millions of dollars. A fun fact, she was so rich that when the US income tax was first implemented, it was intended to hit only those with the very highest incomes, and she was literally the only person in the country it applied to. She could have been one of the few women of that historical period who actually experienced the freedom to do whatever she wanted. And in a sense, she did. When she felt called to become a nun, Katharine Drexel donated her inheritance to spread the Catholic faith among Native American and African American people. The religious order she founded, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, founded schools and universities to address the routine denial of educational opportunities to Black and Native US people. One of the schools they founded is Xavier in New Orleans, the first and only Catholic HBCU. As those institutions gained stability, the sisters turned them over, placing them in the hands of the communities they served. I often think of Katharine Drexel as the patron saint for those of us encountering our own white privilege and trying to think about how we can be better allies for racial justice today. It's very easy to recognize that I have white privilege, but much harder to think that moving toward racial equality might mean I have to give something up, even if that's a privilege I did nothing to earn. And Katharine has a lot to teach us there, even though, like all the saints, she was far from perfect. But even if that's not your journey, her practice of temperance is something we can all learn from in these hard days of 2021. The theologian M. Sean Copeland, who taught here years ago, says that one expression of temperance is sacrifice, giving something up. Katharine Drexel gave up a lot in her life, losing her parents young, giving up regular contact with her family when she became a nun, as was typical back then, and of course, giving up her wealth. And it's pretty clear that this regular practice of sacrifice set her up to do the thing we admire her for today, building great resources like educational institutions and handing them over to be controlled by not her, but the communities who needed them most. She wasn't out to build an educational empire. And I say that as we're all part of the educational empire of the Jesuits, which we love dearly. She was out to empower Native and Black Catholic communities, even if that meant giving up her own power. Katharine Drexel had a lot of practice giving things up. And in these hard days, we're all being asked to give a lot of things up. High school graduation, big family events, a normal college experience. Some of you may have lost loved ones this year, may have job loss or illness in the family. We've all given up the sense of moving around freely and taking our own health and autonomy for granted. And we could all think of more things that this year has taken from us, I'm sure. What Katharine Drexel shows us is that we can grow from those losses. And that doesn't mean we have to paper it over and pretend everything's fine. When we lose things that matter deeply, like a joyous event or even a dear loved one, of course we feel sad and grieve the loss. But even that sad and hard giving up can train us in the skill, so we can use it later to serve God. God might call on you to give up things that really aren't good at all, like unearned power and privilege. God might call you to give up something that's good, but not where God is calling you, like maybe a certain job or partner, a certain vision of what your life was going to look like. So sometimes it feels like all we're doing this year is losing things. Another way to look at it is a kind of training. We're all really in training and giving up. And later, I think we'll be able to flex that muscle of temperance. I hope we can all learn from this year how to integrate our desires, not so they go away completely, but so we can use them as they're meant to be used to serve God and each other. I want to say one more thing about temperance. The goal is not to give away so much that you grind yourself down into a little nub of nothing. Through temperance, we build the skill of using our desires for good. The point is not to have no desires at all. Katharine Drexel was an educated woman with strong leadership skills, and God used her in that capacity. Her temperance helped her serve God. It didn't turn her into somebody else. Here's a quote from her that might be one of my favorite sayings from a saint ever. She wrote this in her diary, speaking to herself. She wrote, "Try to speak only and when it pleases God, but lose no opportunity of speaking before priests and bearded men. Manifest yourself. You have no time to occupy your thoughts without complacency or consideration of what others think. Your business is simply, what will my Father in heaven think?" Prayer and discernment are where you figure out what God will think, and the virtues are the skills you use to follow up on those plans. So these are hard days. I wish things were different. When every day seems to bring a new challenge and even a new calamity that shakes our worldview, it's easy to forget the fact that we're becoming something during these long, hard days. We're continuing to become something, maybe something better than we were, and maybe something worse. But with God's help, and if we're paying attention, we can hope for growth in virtue. Malcolm X in prison could have become a hardened criminal, but instead he developed a love of learning and became a man of God. Katharine's lifetime practice of giving up helped her shape a life of gift to others. Right now, we can't do everything we'd like to, but we can seek the truth, even when it challenges us, and work to defend it. We can ask God to help us grow through our losses, to help us grow in virtue, to send us opportunities to practice virtue, and for the grace to know when those opportunities are here. Thank you.
Now I think we're going to lead it to questions. Anyone's got any? Got one question over here.
So my question is, what would be your suggestion? Because I mean, I'm not planning on giving up all my money anytime soon, of like using kind of small sacrifices kind of day to day in order to practice temperance.
Oh, what a great question. There are so many different ways to do it, right? Like, a very traditional Christian practice is obviously fasting, and we're coming up on Lent, so there are those sort of built-in abstaining from food or avoiding different kinds of food. A way that sort of fits with the abundance that we have around us now might just be to like choose things that are plain or not your favorite thing. Stuff around food can also be problematic for a lot of folks, though, if you feel like that is drawing you in an unhealthy way. You could give up social media for various times, like one day every week. That would be a pretty big practice of temperance, I think, for a lot of us. Or one Lent, when I had a long commute, I gave up listening to music in the car, and that ended up being a really great, just inviting more silence into my life. So anything I think that you can just kind of push on a button and see what happens, right? Maybe if it's totally easy, maybe that's not something you're too attached to. But if it's something that feels like, oh no way, I could never do that, that might be something to maybe like investigate a little bit more and see if it would be good for you to play with giving a little act of temperance.
Anyone else got any questions? We got one over here.
Just more of like a personal question for you. So obviously this is like a lot of a big chunk of like what you've dedicated your research to, I'm guessing, just kind of in your life. What made you feel called to this specific area of, I guess there's a lot of theology to study out there. What made you feel called to this specific area?
Oh, I love that question. I just find virtue very innately appealing. Like, it's helped me make sense of trying to follow God and given me a language for that in a way that nothing else had. I do find it accessible to think about, what virtue am I struggling with? How could I practice it more? Even just, navigating the pandemic became much easier for me when I realized that it was practice and temperance. So yeah, it's just the innate feel of it that I really liked.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Got any other questions?
Actually, I do have a follow-up one.
Perfect.
So you covered two virtues here tonight. If you would have had time to cover another virtue, what's another one you feel like is really important for all of us to kind of learn and practice?
Oh, what a good question. So I'm just going to run through and see what jumps out at me. The classical virtues are prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. There's a more contemporary framing that's prudence, justice, fidelity, and self-care, where fidelity is the virtue where you honor your close relationships, and then self-care is the virtue through which you care for yourself. There's also the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. Traditionally speaking, faith, hope, and love are not virtues we work to acquire. They're virtues that can only be given to us as a gift by God. But I think all of those are really important to think about during this time, maybe especially hope. And some theologians are kind of thinking about, isn't it true that, for example, being part of a faith community is an act of cultivating faith, even if you still need God to give it to you, right? So there's maybe some pushback going on there. Yeah, I think the virtue, and also I think like we can be tempted to think of hope as something that you have to kind of like force yourself to do, right? And like overcome your sadness and your anxiety. And it's like, just look on the bright side. And it really doesn't work that way. But if you think about it as a spiritual gift that you can ask God's help with, I think that can be much more freeing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going from Steve.
Oh,
okay, really? Okay, perfect.
So, question for you about perspective. In the sense of,
I can't hear. I'm sorry.
So,
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, question for you about Malcolm X. So he makes the Hajj, big moment, sees the universality or the diversity of Islam. And that was, as you said, a big moment for him where suddenly like, wow. So he came from maybe a more narrow view and had this was able to go out and have this broad experience. Any words of wisdom for us today in that we're in this narrow view with COVID? Some days I feel like the walls are closing in on me and they're pretty much the same. And it's hard to go out physically, which can be so freeing to have like, new perspective. Advice on maybe how to do the interior going out in the midst of this pandemic.
Oh, that is such a great question. I was trying to think of how can I frame the search for truth so it doesn't sound like going down an internet rabbit hole and ending up an anti-vaxxer or something like that, because like the search for truth, everybody thinks they're on the search for truth, right? And I did want to, I think it's important, just like you said, that he was out there meeting people and really praying, his body was in that place and he was in that community with those people. I think that's not an accident, not a coincidence. I think I was so changed by reading his autobiography and by reading Katharine Drexel's autobiography. So I think like we can still learn from people even if we can't always be with them physically. And there's something about the story of a person's life that is, to me, has a bit more of that encounter aspect that Pope Francis always talks about, right? Where you're really meeting someone with their gifts and flaws. So maybe try to learn about people's lives. I think that's all I've got. I don't know, Steve. I think that's a great question. I don't know if I have a really great answer.
I think it was great. Malcolm X's autobiography changed my life in college.
Yeah.
I got it as a free book, best free book I've ever gotten in my life.
Awesome.
So thank you.
One over here.
Hello. So racial injustice has been something that has been really.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, I can talk a little bit louder. Is this better? Okay, so racial injustice has been kind of a focal point for the past year or so. It's been something that we've seen movements of. It's been something on the forefront of our minds politically, socially, religiously. How do you think St. Katharine Drexel would respond to the racial injustice that we are seeing, and how do you think she would encourage us to respond?
Yeah, I think she's a really good exemplar for the idea that white people need to like step back and cede power and like transfer. Honestly, something that a lot of contemporary racial justice movements talk about is like white people transfer resources to Black-led organizations. That's literally what she did. I'm not aware that she talked about it in those terms. I'd like to know more about how she and her order really thought of that, but you can't deny that that's what they did. So, and I think virtue also suggests that practice shapes our attitudes, right? So where you put your money and your resources will help you direct your attentions and direct your heart as well.
Thank you.
Got another question? Done, I guess that's gonna be it, right? Yeah, let's thank Dr. Drexel.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Ward, this was excellent.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Have a good night.